Hello, and welcome back to Baby Alias's stories. We now return to Child 44 by Tom Rob Smith. Moscow, same day. Despite the many hundreds of soldiers and agents now searching for the fugitives, Vasily was convinced that none of them would succeed. Although the odds were heavily weighted in the state's favor, they were chasing a man who'd been trained to avoid detection and survive in hostile territory. There was a belief in some quarters that Leo and Raiza must have had assistance, either from treacherous guards or from people waiting at a designated location on the railway line who'd orchestrated the breakout. This had been contradicted by the confessions of the prisoners who'd been traveling in Leo's carriage. They declared under duress that they'd escaped alone. That wasn't what the guards wanted to hear. It embarrassed them. So far, the search had focused on possible approach routes towards the Scandinavian border, the northern coastline, and the Baltic Sea. It was taken for granted that Leo would try and cross into another country, probably using a fishing boat. Once in the West, he'd connect with senior government figures who'd gladly aid and shelter him in exchange for information. For this reason, his capture was considered a matter of the highest urgency. Leo had the potential to inflict untold damage on Soviet Russia. Vasily dismissed the idea that Leo's escape had been assisted. There was simply no way anyone could have known which train the prisoners would be on. The process of getting them on a Gulag transport had been hurried, improvised, and last minute. He'd pushed it through without the proper paperwork or procedure. The only person who could have helped them escape was him. This meant that there was a chance, no matter how ridiculous the notion, that he'd be blamed. It seemed that Leo had the potential to ruin him after all. So far, none of the search groups had found any trace of them. Neither Leo nor Raiza had any family or friends in that area of the country. They should be alone, in rags, penniless. When he'd last spoken to Leo, the man hadn't even known his own name. Evidently, he'd regained his wits. Vasily had to figure out where Leo was going. That was the best way to trap him, rather than searching the countryside at random. Having failed to recapture his own denounced brother, he must succeed in capturing Leo. He wouldn't survive another failure. Vasily didn't believe that Leo had any interest in fleeing to the west. Would he return to Moscow? His parents lived here, but his parents couldn't help him, and they'd lose their life if he turned up on their doorstep. They were now under armed surveillance. Perhaps he'd want revenge. Perhaps he'd turn up to kill Vasily. He mulled over this idea briefly, flattered by it, before rejecting it. He'd never felt anything personal about Leo's dislike of him. There was no way he'd risk his wife's life for an act of revenge. There was no way he'd risk his wife's life for an act of revenge. Leo had an agenda, and it was rooted in the pages of this captured case file. Vasily studied the stack of documents accumulated over the past month by both Leo and the local militia officer whom he'd convinced to help him. There were photos of murdered children, witness statements. There were court documents about convicted suspects. During his interrogation, Leo had denounced this work. Vasily knew that denunciation was a lie. Leo was a believer, and he believed in this fanciful theory. But what exactly did they believe? A single killer was responsible for all these motiveless murders? Murders spread over many hundreds of kilometers in over 30 different locations. Aside from the theory itself being bizarre, it meant they could be heading anywhere. Vasily could hardly pick one of these locations and wait. Frustrated, he re-examined the map marked with each alleged murder, numbered chronologically. 44. Vasily tapped the number. He picked up the phone. "Bring me Officer Fyodor Andreev." Since Vasily had been promoted, he'd been rewarded with his own smoffle. He'd been rewarded with his own office, a small space, admittedly, but one of which he was immensely proud, as if each square meter had been personally conquered during a military campaign. There was a knock on the door. Fyodor Andreev entered, now one of Vasily's subordinates. A youngish man, loyal, hardworking, and not too bright. Perfect virtues in a subordinate. He was nervous. Vasily smiled, gesturing for Fyodor to sit down. "Thank you for coming. I need your help." "Certainly, sir." "You're aware that Leo Demidov is a fugitive?" "Yes, sir. I've heard." "What do you know of the reasons behind Leo's arrest?" "Nothing." "We believe that he was working for Western governments, collecting information, spying. But that turns out not to be true. We were wrong. Leo wouldn't tell us anything during his interrogation. Now, blatantly, I found out that he was working on this." Fyodor stood up, staring at the case file on the table. He'd seen these documents before. They'd been taped to Leo's chest. Fyodor was beginning to sweat. He leaned forward, as though examining these papers for the first time, trying to hide the fact that he was trembling. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see that Vasily had moved and was now standing beside him, staring down at the pages as though they were working together. Partners. Vasily's fingers slid across the map, slowly reaching Moscow and tapping 44. Fyodor felt sick. He turned his head to see Vasily's face close to his own. "Fyodor, we know Leo came to Moscow recently. I now believe that rather than spying, this journey was in fact part of his investigation. You see, he believes that a murder took place here. Your son was murdered. Am I correct?" "No, sir. He was killed in an accident. He was cut down by a train." "Leo was sent to deal with the matter?" "Yes, but... And at that time you believed that the boy was murdered. Am I right?" "At the time, I was upset. It was very difficult. So, when Leo came back to Moscow to investigate, it wasn't your child that he was interested in?" "No, sir." "How do you know?" "Sir, how do you know what Leo was or wasn't interested in?" Vasily took a seat, glancing at his fingernails, pretending to be hurt. "Fyodor, you obviously have a very low opinion of me." "That's not true, sir." "You must understand that if Leo is right, if there is a child murderer, then he needs to be caught. I want to help Leo. Fyodor, I have children of my own. It is my duty as a father and as an officer to stop these terrible crimes. This supersedes any personal animosity that exists between Leo and myself. If I wanted Leo dead, I would simply do nothing. At the moment, everyone considers both him and his wife to be spies. They will be shot on sight, and I fear their investigation will be lost. More children will die. However, if I had all the facts, I might be able to persuade my superiors to call off the manhunt. If I don't, what chance do Leo and Raiza have? None. Vasily nodded, pleased with the confirmation. It was true, then. Leo was convinced that there was one man responsible for all these deaths. Vasily continued. My point exactly. They have no money. They're hundreds of kilometers from their destination. Where did they escape? Fyodor's second mistake, revealing that he too believed Leo would be intent on catching this killer. All Vasily needed now was the destination itself. He pointed east of Moscow, the train lines, and watched as Fyodor's eyes moved from that position across the map, southwards. Leo was heading south, but Vasily still needed a name. Coaxing Fyodor, he remarked, the majority of the murders are taking place in the south. Just from glancing at this map, Fyodor paused. It was possible to tip Vasily off without incriminating himself. They could then jointly petition their superior officers to change their mind about Leo and Raiza. Fyodor had been looking for a way to help them. This was it. He turned them from villains into heroes. When they'd met in Moscow, Leo had mentioned that a militia officer had traveled to Rostov to confirm that the city was the most probable location for the killer. Fyodor pretended to scrutinize the papers. Judging from the concentration of the murders, I'd say the city of Rostov-on-Don. All the early murders were in the south. He must live there, or somewhere near there. Rostov? What do you think is the best way of convincing our superiors? I need to understand everything. We'd be taking a great risk, putting our necks on the line. Putting our necks on the line. We have to be sure. Show me again. Why do you believe this killer lives in the south? With Fyodor engrossed in the documents, talking about this and that, Vasily stood up, stepped around the desk, drew his gun, and aimed at Fyodor's heart. Southeastern Rostov Oblast, 14 July. Leo and Raiza were in a crate 1 meter high and 2 meters wide. Human cargo, contraband, in the process of being smuggled south. After the military had completed their search of the Kolkhoz, the villagers had taken Leo and Raiza by truck to the nearest town, Ryazan, where they'd introduce them to friends and family. In the stifling heat of a small apartment filled with an audience of nearly 30 and the fog of cheap cigarette smoke, Leo had told the story of their investigation. No one needed any convincing as to the urgency of the objective, and no one had any difficulty believing that the militia had proved useless in dealing with the killer. They'd never turned to the militia for help or taken their disputes to the authorities, always depending on each other. This was the same, except at stake were the lives of an unknowable number of children. Together, as a collective, plans were laid to transport them south. One member of the audience worked as a truck driver, shuttling loads between Moscow and towns such as Samara and Kharkov. Kharkov was some 300 kilometers north of Rostov, half a day's drive, though it was decided that driving into Rostov itself was too risky since the driver had no business there. He'd be prepared to take them to the nearby town of Shakhty. He could legitimately pass off this diversion by claiming that he was visiting family. That same family would, after listening to the story, almost certainly agree to help Leo and Raiza travel into the city. At the very least, they had a day and a half in this crate, cooped up in complete darkness. The driver was transporting bananas, luxury exotic goods intended for the spetstorgi, shops for high-ranking party figures, the kind of shops Leo and Raiza once bought their own groceries in. Their crate was positioned at the back of the truck, wedged under other crates all filled with precious fruit. It was hot and dry, and the journey uncomfortable. There were breaks every 3 to 4 hours when the driver would stop, slide off the crates above them, letting his human cargo stretch their legs and relieve themselves by the side of the road. In complete darkness, with their legs crossed over each other in opposite corners of the crate, Raiza asked, "Do you trust him?" "Who?" "The driver." "You don't?" "I don't know." "You must have some reason for asking." Of all the people listening to the story, he was the only one who didn't have any questions. He didn't seem to engage with it. It didn't shake him as it shook the others. He seems blank to me, practical, unemotional. He didn't have to help us, and he's not going to be able to betray us and then go back to his friends and family. He could make something up. There was a roadblock. We were caught. He tried to help us, but there was nothing he could do. What do you suggest? At the next stop, you could overpower him, tie him up, and drive the truck yourself. You're serious? The only way to be sure, to be absolutely certain, is to take his truck. We'd have his papers. We'd have our lives back in our hands, back under our control. We're helpless like this. We don't know where he's taking us. You were the one who taught me to trust in the goodness of strangers. This man isn't like the others. He seems ambitious. He spends his entire day transporting luxury items. He must think, I want that. I want those fine textiles, those rare foods. He understands that we're an opportunity. He knows how much he can sell us for, and he knows the price he'll pay for being caught with us. I'm hardly the one to say this, Raiza, but you're talking about an innocent man. A man who seems to be risking his life to help us. I'm talking about guaranteeing that we reach Rostov. Isn't this how it starts? You have a cause you believe in, a cause worth dying for. Soon, it's a cause worth killing for. Soon, it's a cause worth killing innocent people for. We wouldn't have to kill him. Yes, we would, because we couldn't leave him tied up on the roadside. That would be a far greater risk. We either kill him or trust him. Raiza, this is how things fall apart. We've been fed, sheltered, and transported by these people. If we turn on them, execute one of their friends for no reason other than as a precaution, I'd be the same man you despised in Moscow. Even though he couldn't see her, he knew she was smiling. Were you testing me? Just making conversation. Did I pass? That depends on whether we get to Shakhty or not. After a stretch of silence, Raiza asked, "What happens once this is over?" "I don't know. The West will want you, Leo. They'll protect you." I'd never leave this country. Even if this country is going to kill you? If you want to defect, I'll do everything I can to get you onto a boat. What are you going to do? Hide in the hills? Once that man is dead, once you're safely out of the country, I'm going to turn myself in. I don't want to live in exile among people that want my information but hate me. I don't want to live as a foreigner. I can't do it. It would mean that everything these people in Moscow have said about me would be true. And that's the most important thing? Raisa sounded hurt. Leo touched her arm. Raisa, I don't understand. Is it that complicated? I want us to stay together. Leo said nothing for a moment. Finally, he replied, I can't live as a traitor. I can't do it. Which means we've got about 24 hours left. I'm sorry. We should make the most of this time together. How do we do that? We tell each other the truth. The truth? We must have secrets. I know I have mine. We must have secrets. I know I have some. Don't you? Things you've never told me? Yes. Then I'll go first. I used to spit in your tea. After I heard about Zoya's arrest, I was convinced you'd reported her. So for about a week, I spat in your tea. You spat in my tea? For about a week. Why did you stop? You didn't seem to care. I didn't notice. Exactly. Okay, your turn. Truthfully. Truthfully? That's the point of this game. I don't think you married me because you were afraid. I think you scouted me out. You made it look like you were scared. You gave me a false name and I pursued you. But I think you targeted me. I'm a foreign agent. You might know of people working for Western agencies. Maybe you were helping them. Maybe that idea was at the back of your mind when you married me. That's not a secret. That's speculation. You have to share secrets, hard facts. I found a kopeck among your clothes. The coin could be split. The coin could be split it in two. It's a device for smuggling microfilm. Agents use them. No one else would have one. Why didn't you denounce me? I couldn't do it. Leo, I didn't marry you as a way of getting close to the MGP. I told you the truth before. I was scared. And the coin? That coin was mine. Her voice drifted off, as though weighing up whether or not to continue. I didn't use it to carry microfilm. I used it to carry cyanide paste when I was a refugee. Raisa had never spoken about the period after her home had been destroyed. The months on the road, the dark ages of her life. Leo waited, suddenly nervous. I'm sure you can imagine the kind of things that happen to women refugees. Soldiers. They had needs. They were risking their lives. They were owed. We were their payment. After one time, and there were several, I hurt so much. I swore if it ever happened again, if it ever looked like happening again, I'd rub that paste across his gums. They could kill me, hang me, but maybe it would make them think twice about doing it to another woman. Anyway, it became my lucky coin because as soon as I started carrying it, I never had any problems. Maybe men can sense a woman with cyanide in their pocket. Maybe men can sense a woman with cyanide in her pocket. Of course, it didn't cure the injuries I'd sustained. There was no medicine. That's the reason I can't get pregnant, Leo. Leo stared into the darkness, at the place where he's imagined, at the place where he imagined his wife must be. During the war, women had been raped during the occupation, and then raped again by their liberators. As a soldier, he knew such activity had been sanctioned by the state, considered part of the fabric of war, and an appropriate reward for a brave soldier. Cyanide had been used by some to take their own lives in the face of impossible horrors. Leo supposed that most men might have checked a woman for a blade or a gun, but a coin, that would have slipped their attention. He rubbed the palm of her hand. What else could he do? Apologize? Say he understood? He'd framed that newspaper clipping, hung it on the wall, proud, oblivious to what the war meant to her. Leo, I have another secret. I've fallen in love with you. I've always loved you. That's not a secret, Leo. You're 3 secrets behind. Leo kissed her. I have a brother. Rostov-on-Don, 15 July. Nadia was alone in the house. Her mother and sister had gone to visit their grandmother, and although Nadia had initially accompanied them, as they'd approached her grandmother's apartment block, she'd feigned a stomachache and begged to be allowed to return. Her mother had agreed and Nadia had hurried back home. Her plan was simple. She was going to open the basement door and find out why her father spent so long downstairs in what must be a dark, cold room. She'd never been down there, not once. She'd walked around the building, feeling the damp bricks and imagining what it must be like inside. There were no windows, just a ventilation hole for the stove. It was strictly forbidden, out of bounds, an unbreakable rule of the house. Her father was on a work trip at the moment, but he'd be back soon, perhaps as early as tomorrow, and she'd heard him talk about improving their home, which included building a new door for the basement. Not the front door, not the door that everyone used and which kept the warmth in. His first priority was the basement door. Admittedly, it was flimsy, but all the same, why was it so important? In a couple of days, he'd have fitted a new door which she wouldn't be able to open. If she wanted to break in, if she wanted answers to her questions, she had to do it now. The lock was a simple latch. She'd studied it carefully and tested it to see if a knife could be squeezed in between the door and the frame, lifting up the latch. It could. The latch raised. Nadia pushed the door open. Excited, afraid, she took a step down. She released the door and it swung shut. Some light crept in behind her, under the door and around the sides. Other than that, the only light came through the ventilation hole downstairs. Adjusting her eyes to the gloom, she reached the bottom of the stairs and surveyed her father's secret room. A bed, a stove, a small table, and a chest. There was nothing mysterious. Disappointed, she snooped around. An old lamp hung on the wall, and pinned up beside it were a series of newspaper clippings. She walked towards them. They were all the same. A photograph of a Russian soldier standing beside a burning tank. Some of the photographs had been cropped so that all you could see was the soldier. He was handsome. She didn't recognize him. Puzzled by this collage, she picked up a tin plate which had been left on the floor, no doubt for the cats. Turning her attention to the chest, she put her hands on the top and lifted, just a little, just to see if it was locked. The wooden lid was heavy, but it wasn't locked. What was inside? She lifted it a little more. Suddenly, she heard another noise. The front door. There were heavy footsteps, too heavy for her mother. Her father must have returned early. Light appeared as the door to the basement was opened. Why was he back so soon? Panicking, Nadia lowered the lid, trying not to make a noise, listening to her father's footsteps coming down the stairs. With the lid closed, she dropped to her knees and clambered under the bed, squeezing herself into the small space, watching the bottom step. There they were, his big black boots coming right towards her. Nadia closed her eyes, expecting when she opened her eyes to see his furious face inches away from her. Instead, the entire bed creaked and sank. He was sitting on it. Opening her eyes, she had to scramble out of the way. With the gap between the bed and the floor even smaller, she watched as he began to untie his boot laces. He didn't know she was here. The latch must have locked after she'd shut it. She hadn't been caught. Not yet. What was she going to do? Her father could spend hours down here. Her mother would return and be alarmed that Nadia was at home. Perhaps they'd think she was missing and go look for her. If they did, she'd be able to sneak upstairs and tell some lie about where she'd been. That was her best hope. Until then, she had to remain where she was and keep very quiet. Her father pulled his socks off and stretched his toes. He stood up, the bed rising with him, and fired up the lamp, which gave out a weak light. He walked towards the chest. Nadia could hear the top of the chest being opened, but couldn't see what he'd taken out. He must have left the lid open because she didn't hear it close. What was her father doing? Now he was sitting at one of the chairs, tying something around his foot. It was a strip of rubber. Using string and rags, he seemed to be making some kind of homemade shoe. Aware of something behind her, Nadia turned her head and saw the cat. It had seen her too. Its back was arched and its fur stuck out. She didn't belong down here. It knew that much. Scared, she turned to see if her father had noticed. He dropped to his knees. His face appeared in the gap under the bed. She didn't know what to say. She didn't dare move. He said nothing, standing up, lifting the entire bed upright, exposing her curled up in a ball. Stand up. She couldn't move her arms, her legs. Her body didn't seem to be working. Nadia. Hearing her name, she stood up. Step away from the wall. She obeyed, stepping towards him, her head down, staring at her father's one bare foot and his other foot wrapped in rags. He lowered the bed, putting it back in position. Why are you down here? I wanted to know what you do. Why? I want to spend more time with you. Andrei could feel that urge again. They were alone in the house. She shouldn't have come down here. He told her that for her own sake. He was a different person. He was not her father. He stepped away from his daughter until his back was pressed against the wall, as far from her as the room would allow. Father? Andrei raised a finger to his lips. Control yourself. But he could not. He took his glasses off, folding them up and putting them in his pocket. When he looked at her again, she was nothing more than a blurred outline. No longer his daughter, just a child, indistinct, fuzzy. Any child he chose to imagine. Father? Nadia stood up, walking right up to her father and taking his hand. Don't you like spending time with me? She was too close now. Even without his glasses on, he could see her hair, her face. Wiping his brow, he put his glasses back on. Nadia, you have a younger sister. Why don't you like playing with her? When I was your age, I spent all my time with my brother. You have a brother? Yes. Where is he? Andrei pointed at the wall, the photos of the Russian soldier. What's his name? Pavel. Why doesn't he visit us? He will. Rostov Oblast, 8 kilometers north of Rostov-on-Don. 16 July. They were seated on an elektrishka traveling towards the outskirts of the city, edging closer to their destination, the center of Rostov-on-Don. The truck driver hadn't betrayed them. He'd taken them through several checkpoints and dropped them at the town of Shekty, where they'd spent the night with the driver's mother-in-law, a woman called Sarah Karlovna, and her family. Sarah, in her 50s, lived with some of her children, including a daughter who was married with 3 children of her own. Sarah's parents also lived in the apartment, a total of 11 people in 3 bedrooms, a different generation in each bedroom. For the 3rd time, Leo had told the story of his investigation. Unlike the towns in the north, they'd already heard of these crimes, the child murders. According to Sarah, there were few people in this oblast who weren't aware of the rumors. Even so, they knew no facts. When confronted with the estimated number of victims, the room had fallen silent. It had never been a question of whether or not they'd agree to help. This extended family had immediately set about making plans. Leo and Raisa had decided to wait until dusk before traveling into the city, since there'd be fewer people at the factory at night. There was also a greater chance the killer would be at home. It had also been decided that they shouldn't travel alone. For this reason, they were now accompanied by 3 small children and 2 energetic grandparents. Leo and Raisa were playing the parts of a mother and father, while the real mother and father remained in Shakti. This semblance of a family was a precautionary measure. If the hunt for them had reached Rostov, if the state had guessed that their objective wasn't to flee the country, then they'd be looking for a man and woman traveling together. It had proved impossible for either of them to change their appearance to any significant degree. They'd both cut their hair short. They'd been given a new set of clothes. Even so, without the family surrounding them, they would have been easy to spot. Raisa had expressed concerns about using the children, worried she was putting them in danger. It had been decided that if something should go wrong, if they were caught, then the grandparents would claim that Leo had threatened them and that they feared for their lives if they didn't help. The train stopped. Leo glanced out of the window. The station was busy. He could see several uniformed officers patrolling the platform. The 7 of them got off the train. Raisa was carrying the smallest child, a young boy. All 3 children had been instructed to behave boisterously. The older of the 2 boys understood the nature of the deception and played their part, but the youngest boy was confused and merely stared at Raisa, his lips downturned, sensitive to danger and no doubt wishing he was at home. Only the most observant of officers would suspect that this family was a fraud. There were guards dotted around the platform and concourse, too many for an ordinary day in an ordinary station. They were looking for someone. Though Leo tried to reassure himself that there were many people being hunted and arrested, his gut told him that they were looking for them. The exit was 50 paces away. Concentrate on that. They were almost there. 2 armed officer stepped in front of them. "Where are you traveling from? And where are you traveling to?" For a moment, Raisa couldn't speak. The words evaporated. In order not to appear frozen, she moved the young boy from one arm to the other arm and laughed. "They get so heavy." Leo stepped in. "We've just visited her sister. She lives in Shakti. She's getting married." The grandmother added, "To a man who's drunk. I disapprove. I told her not to do it." Leo smiled, addressing the grandmother. "You want her to marry a man who only drinks water? That would be better." The grandfather nodded before adding, "He can drink, but why does he have to be so ugly?" Both grandparents laughed. The officers did not. One of them turned to the little boy. "What's his name?" The question was directed at Raisa. Once again her mind went blank. She couldn't remember. Nothing was coming to her. Plucking a name from her memory. "Alexander." The boy shook his head. "My name is Ivan." Raisa laughed. "I like to tease him. I'm always getting the brothers' names muddled, and it drives them mad. This young man I'm carrying is Ivan. That is Mikhail." That was the middle child's name. Raisa now remembered that the eldest was called Alexei. But for her lie to work, he would have to pretend his name was Alexander. "My eldest boy is called Alexander." The boy opened his mouth to contradict, but the grandfather quickly stepped in and rubbed his head affectionately. Annoyed, the boy shook his head. "Don't do that! I'm not a child anymore!" Raisa struggled not to let her relief show. The officer stepped out of their way, and she led her imitation family out of the station. Once they were out of sight of the station, they bade farewell to the family, splitting up. Leo and Raisa got into a taxi. They'd already given Sarah's family all the information pertaining to their investigation. If Leo and Raisa failed for whatever reason, if the murders continued, then the family would inherit the investigation. They'd organize others in an attempt to find this man, making sure that if any one group failed, there would be another ready to take their place. He mustn't be allowed to survive. Leo appreciated that it was a mob execution. No court, no evidence or trial. An execution based upon circumstantial evidence, and that in trying to exact justice, they were forced to imitate the very system they were up against. Sitting in the back of the taxi, a Volga, almost certainly one produced in Vualsk, neither Leo nor Raisa spoke. They didn't need to. The plan was in place. Leo was going to enter the Rostov-on-Don factory and break into the employment records. He didn't know how exactly. He'd have to improvise. Raisa was going to remain with the taxi, convincing the driver if he became suspicious that all was well. He'd been paid in advance and generously to keep him placid and obedient. Once Leo had found the killer's name and address, they'd need the driver to take them to where the killer lived. If the killer wasn't home, if he was traveling, they would try to find out when he'd be back. They'd return to Shakti, remain with Sarah's family, and wait. The taxi stopped. Raisa touched Leo's hand. He was nervous, his voice barely a whisper. "If I'm not back in an hour, I know." Leo got out, shutting the door. There were guards stationed at the main gates, although they didn't seem to be particularly alert. Judging from the security arrangements, Leo was almost certain no one in the MGB had guessed that this tractor factory was his destination. There was a chance that the front guards had been deliberately reduced in number as a way of luring him in, but he doubted it. They might have guessed that he was heading to Rostov, but they hadn't figured out where exactly. Walking around the back, he discovered the point where the wire fencing was sheltered from view by the side of a brick building. He clambered up, straddling the barbed wire, and lowered himself down. He was in. The factory ran a 24-hour production line. There were shift workers, but not many people around. The grounds were vast. Several thousand people must be employed here. Leo reckoned as many as 10,000 bookkeeping, cleaning, shipments, and the production line itself. With the additional split between day and night workers, he doubted if anyone would recognize him as a stranger. He walked calmly, purposefully, as if he belonged here, making his way towards the largest of the buildings. Two men exited, smoking, heading in the direction of the front gates. Maybe they'd finished for the night. They saw him and paused. Unable to ignore them, Leo waved, moving towards them. I'm a Tolkach, working for the car factory in Vualsk. I was meant to arrive much earlier, but my train was delayed. Where's the administrative building? It doesn't have a separate building. The main office is inside, on one of the upper floors. I'll take you there. I'm sure I'll find it. I'm not in any rush to get home. I'll take you there. Leo smiled. He couldn't refuse. The two men said goodbye to each other, and Leo followed his unwanted escort into the main assembly plant. Stepping inside, Leo briefly forgot himself. The sheer size, the high roof, the noise of the machinery, all creating a sense of wonder normally reserved for religious institutions. But, of course, this was the new church, the people's cathedral, and the sense of awe was almost as important as the machines it produced. Leo and this man walked side by side, making idle conversation. Leo was suddenly glad of his escort. It meant no one looked twice at them. All the same, he wondered how he was going to get rid of him. They took the stairs off the main factory floor, climbing up towards the administrative department. The man said, I don't know how many people are going to be there. They don't normally work night shifts. Leo still didn't have a clear idea of what he was going to do next. Could he bluff his way through? It seemed unlikely considering the sensitive information he needed. They wouldn't just give it to him no matter what excuse he came up with. If he'd still had his state security identification card, it would have been easy. They turned the corner. The corridor leading to the office had views over the factory floor. Whatever Leo decided to do, he'd be visible to the workers below. The man knocked on the door. Everything now depended on how many people were inside. The door was opened by an older man, a bookkeeper perhaps, dressed in a suit, with sallow skin and a bitter expression. What do you want? Leo peered over the bookkeeper's shoulder. The office was empty. Leo swung around, punching his escort in the stomach, causing him to double up. Before the bookkeeper had time to react, Leo had his hand tight around the old man's neck. Do as I say, and you'll live. Understand? He nodded. Leo slowly released his neck. Close all the blinds, and remove your tie. Leo pulled the younger man, who was still wheezing, inside. He shut the door, locking it behind him. The bookkeeper took off his tie, throwing it to Leo before moving to the windows, shutting out the view over the factory. Using the tie, Leo secured the young man's hands behind his back, all the time keeping his eye on the bookkeeper. He doubted if there was a weapon or alarm in here. There was nothing worth stealing. With the blinds closed, the man turned back to Leo. "What do you want?" "The employment records." Baffled but obedient, the man unlocked the filing cabinet. Leo moved forward, standing beside him. "Stay there. Don't move, and keep your hands on top of the cabinet." There were thousands and thousands of files, extensive documentation, not just for the current workforce, but for people who'd left. Toll catches weren't supposed to exist, since their necessity implied some fault in distribution and production. It was unlikely they'd be listed under that title. "Where are the files on your toll catches?" The old man opened up a cabinet, taking out a thick file. The front was marked "Researchers," a cover. As far as Leo could tell, there were 5 toll cacks currently on the payroll. Nervous, their entire investigation rested on these documents. He checked the employment history of these men. Where had they been sent and when? If these dates corresponded to the murders, he would have found the killer, at least in his own mind. If it was enough of a match, he'd go to the man and confront him. He was sure face to face, confronted with his crime, the killer would crack. He ran his fingers down the list, comparing it to the dates and places held in his memory. The first list didn't match. Leo paused for a moment, wondering about his own powers of recall. But the 3 dates he couldn't forget were the murders in Vualsk and the murder in Moscow. These Tolkach had never been there or anywhere along the Trans-Siberian Railway line. Leo opened the second file, ignoring the personal information and moving to the employment record. This person had only started working last month. Leo pushed the files aside, opening the third file. It didn't match. There were only 2 files left. He flicked to the fourth. Vualsk, Molotov, Vyatka, Gorky, a row of towns which followed the train line west towards Moscow. Moving south from Moscow, there were the towns of Tula and Orel. Now into the Ukraine, Leo saw the towns of Kharkov and Gorlovka, Zaporozhye and Kramatorsk. In all these towns there had been murders. He shut the file. Before he studied the personal details, he checked the 5th file. Barely able to concentrate, he ran his finger down the list. There were some cross-references, but no perfect fit. Leo returned to the 4th file. He flicked to the front page, staring at the small black and white photo. This man was wearing glasses. His name was Andrei.